Hello, friend. Once again, we're back with another amazing story of another Muslim who has left Islam for Christianity. My sister is going to be the first Sudani ex Muslim I have interviewed on this channel, which is going to be amazing. I had Pakistani Muslim, Indian Muslim, Filipino Muslim, Indonesian Muslim, Iranian, Afghan, Chechnyan, Bosnian. Oh my goodness, and the list goes on. As I always mention, this is a great time. This is a great opportunity. Wherever you are, make sure you subscribe to this channel. Make sure you share these stories because Muslims need to see that other Muslims are abandoning Islam for the sake of Christianity, and there is the possibility. I want them to see there is a possibility because when you're a Muslim, you're stuck. You think you're born a Muslim, Allah's qadar, Allah's uh, um, doctrine of destiny is I'm locked in this and I have to die like this. But because of the Lord Jesus Christ, Muslims, you can come out and accept the truth of the Word of God, the truth of the Bible, the truth of Christianity, and you'll be set free. But before any more introductions, I just want to thank you, sister, for accepting my invitation, being on this channel on a beautiful Saturday, being live on this channel. Tell us what is your story. Tell us about your YouTube channel and what you do out there, and tell us what is going on in your world.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you for having me. It's such an honor. I've been following your work for a little while. Thanks for everything that you do in your ministry as well. So, I can start a little bit about myself. So, I was born in Sudan, but I didn't spend too much time there. When I was very young, my family moved to Saudi Arabia. So, I spent the first 8 or so years of my life there, with an exception of one school year that I actually spent in Sudan. So, first grade was in Sudan. Um, and living in Saudi Arabia was interesting. And this was 20 plus years ago at this point. So I know things have changed. I'm sure things are different, significantly. But at the time, it was a difficult place to be for people who are not Saudi Arabian. Especially being Sudanese, being a Black person, there was definitely a lot of racism that I had to deal with. And the unfortunate part is that the racism wasn't just at the hands of the students, but the teachers in school, for instance. So I remember, for instance, being in second grade and having the fifth graders, who to me seemed like giants because they're so much older than I was, pick on me at recess. Anytime they accidentally brushed against me or touched my hair, they recoiled in disgust because, oh, she's dirty, she's Black. The teachers, on the other hand, were very biased in how they graded your work. So in subjects as objective as mathematics or spelling, where you could easily prove that you got an answer correct, they would mark my answers as incorrect. I could prove to them that they were. And, my parents sometimes would come into the school and complain to the teachers, and they would do nothing about it. And what could you do, right? There's really nothing that you could do. And the whole idea behind that is because they ranked students every year, they had to ensure that the highest ranked students were Saudi girls. They didn't want any foreigners to be any of the higher ranked students. So it was very demotivating. It was infuriating because really there's nothing that you can do in response to that. So racism in general, just kind of like a quick aside, is something that unfortunately exists in a lot of Muslim majority environments, I notice. And it's something that I even experienced, in the United States growing up here. Um, there's this specific word, abd, that people might be familiar with, which means slave, that's often used for people who are Black. And the sad part is it's not just something that, let's say, non-Black Arabs would use to, someone who's Black, but even Black Arabs, like Sudanese people, unfortunately, also engage in that, unfortunately. So they see themselves, for instance, as, a Sudanese Arab who is also Black, sees himself as higher than like a non-Arab Sudanese Black person. So it just runs so deep. And I used to think that, oh, Islam was anti-racist. So the issue isn't the religion at all. And it's just a culture. But why is it that this is something that's persistent across these cultures? And then, I was kind of naive, but now I realize there's a lot of tribalism in Islam. There are a lot of issues within the sources themselves that seem to indicate that there might have even been racism, at the time of Muhammad. So it's not surprising that this exists. And then the prejudice extended beyond just race, but also to those who didn't believe in Islam. So I remember learning in school in Saudi Arabia about the kuffar, right, the disbelievers, and specifically like the Jews and the Christians. And I remember feeling, I'm so lucky to be Muslim. I'm so lucky to have been born in this religion. And, all these disbelievers, what is their life like? I assumed that they were backward, that they were incompetent, that they were dirty, because that's what you're taught. And I couldn't have possibly imagined ever being in a place, honestly, where I'm like befriending people who were, in my mind, so different from who I was. Another interesting thing about Saudi Arabia at the time, which I don't think this exists now, is that they had the self-appointed morality police. So they would go around with their megaphones screaming at people in public whenever they saw anybody breaking the Sharia in any way. So this often just ended up meaning screaming at women, because that's the only visible way that you can actually see someone in their, in their understanding breaking the Sharia. So whenever a woman wasn't covering her face, they would take out their megaphone and start screaming. And so we would be at the mall or the market, and whenever people would see their car drive by, all the women who had their niqab like on the back of their head would immediately cover their faces at the time. So there was just this constant fear and surveillance at the time. And I was young enough, fortunately, that I didn't have to deal with a lot of the sexism that girls older than I was and women definitely had to deal with. I left Saudi Arabia when I was around 8.5 years old. So my family then moved to the United States. And so I've been living here ever since. And I've grown up here, and this is now where I consider home. So it's where I spent most of my childhood and where I studied, obviously. But a lot of the teachings from Saudi Arabia kind of migrated with me. My mother had spent some time taking classes on Islam in Saudi Arabia, which, in my viewpoint, kind of corrupted her a little bit, because she kind of got the Saudi understanding of what religion is, which I don't know, one could say is the most faithful understanding to the original sources. It's debatable, but it was a very extreme expression of Islam. And I say that because, I've seen other Muslims that have less extreme versions of Islam. But the sad part is, if you do look at the Muslim sources themselves, the primary sources, they do sort of reflect that extreme version. And so from a very early age, I was kind of fed this message that my worth as a girl was very much tied to like marriageability, was very much tied to like, family honor, and making sure that I don't, cause any um, dishonor to the family just in the way that I dressed, in the way that I behaved. Things were very extreme, even down to not being able to laugh in public, right? That was considered a problem. Not wearing perfume. My mother kind of took it to another extreme that you often, I think, don't see, where, for instance, she went around cutting up and like getting rid of old family photos, because she believed that photos were haram or forbidden. And I think this kind of was a level that my father even couldn't handle at the time. And this is why we were actually sent to Sudan for a little while. So it was a bad reaction to a bad situation. So all around, it was just not a great environment. Um, and then at the age of 9, so came to the US, is when 9/11 happened. So it was a year after I came. And I had decided, bad timing, but I decided to start wearing the hijab to school. So school started in September. And it was right before 9/11. And the reaction I got from my fellow students was not great. I was definitely bullied for being the very obviously Muslim kid at the time, and was called a terrorist. And, I was being asked a lot of questions that I just didn't have the answers to, because I, barely understood my own faith at the time. So ultimately, I ended up taking off the hijab, even though I actually didn't want to, and it was kind of embarrassing for me to. But I did that, and but I also, it created this hunger inside me of wanting to know more about my own background, about my own faith tradition, to be able to, let's say, defend it. Um, I had this experience with a fellow classmate where I remember her asking me, "Are you with them or are you with us?" And I was like, "Well, who's them?" And she was like, "The Muslims." And I was like, "Well, obviously I'm with them. I'm a Muslim, so I'm not with you." But, in her mind, Muslim, she was equating that to terrorists. So she was, telling all the other students, "Oh, she's a terrorist." And that was not a great day. But I understand, they were kids. I was a kid. There was a lot of ignorance on both sides for sure. But it was definitely a difficult time. And as is the case, I think, with a lot of people who lived through 9/11 in the United States, it kind of makes you want to cling to the faith a bit more. It's like an identity now that you're being attacked, especially. You definitely want to draw closer to it, especially when you feel like you're being unfairly attacked, which I definitely felt at the time. Another major thing that happened at that same year is my younger brother was born. So this was, looking back on it now, I realize my depression probably started around this age. And it was the age at which I was told that I'm not old enough to have a kid myself, which I totally was not. Even biologically, I wasn't. And because my brother was born, I had to now take care of him. And so I had to do, everything for him, and started having to clean around the house and being responsible for my siblings. And I wasn't, the firstborn, but just being the eldest daughter, I had to do that. And I remember, for instance, having to sit and watch my younger brother sleep in his crib for hours just so that he wouldn't like suffocate or something while I watched all the other kids playing outside. And it really bothered me that I had to be treated this way just because I was a girl. And I was expected to do certain things that, even my older sibling didn't have to do. Um, and I didn't really know how to deal with that at the time, but I started just feeling super depressed and thinking that there's no point to life at that very early age, like really, really young. There's no reason that someone at 9 years old should be feeling this way. My mother, by the time I went through puberty, was around 12 years of age, told me that I should no longer, for instance, ride my bike outside. And that was devastating to me because I love riding a bike. And now I still love riding bikes. It's almost kind of like I'm making up for lost time. But it was all of a sudden, everything was being policed about who I was as a person. Okay, you have to wear long shirts, you can't, wear anything that was revealing in any way, not even, close to our definition of revealing. But I felt very suffocated, and it became so intense that I kind of responded to that by sort of becoming a bit of an extreme feminist myself and feeling like, okay, I have to respond to this by being super pro women, pro and almost anti men. I remember thinking when people would tell me, well, one day you'll grow up and you'll have a son, and saying explicitly, if I ever have a son, I'll throw him in the trash. This is me being a kid. And just feeling like I see society holding boys up, that I want to be kind of like the response to that and do the exact opposite. And I want to maybe have a chance to be able to hold girls up, right? And show that they're worth something. And so another part of my response was also trying to prove that I could do well in school, right? And not be a liability. And that I could be just as smart as the boys. And I definitely, I think, ended up taking it to an extreme. But with trying to one up the boys, I even wanted to like arm wrestle boys and show that I was stronger than them physically, which I obviously am not. But I was really just trying to prove myself. Then in high school, this was around the time when Dr. Zakir Naik was kind of blowing up, and his whole, Peace TV was pretty big. So I started watching a lot of Dr. Zakir Naik to be able to respond to the questions that I would get from my classmates about Islam. But it also gave me an opportunity to, for once, go on the attack, right? I can go on the offensive now because I was equipped with all these so called contradictions that he would point out. So I bought a Bible from the Dollar Tree, I remember, and I would bring it to my classmates and I'd point out all these, contradictions that they, of course, couldn't answer. So in my mind, I'd won. And if I really wanted to give someone a hard time, I would just ask them to explain the Trinity, which oftentimes they just couldn't do. Of course, there were kids, and the Trinity is not a simple topic, right? So I understood it, but it gave me a sense of power, I guess, that I can kind of almost respond in a way that I couldn't in the past, and it really made me feel like, oh, Islam is logical. It made way more sense than Christianity because I can understand it. I can hold it in my head, right? Even like the concept of God. Then in college, I was still drawn to learning more about the faith, that I actually ended up concentrating on like Middle Eastern studies, right? Which isn't necessarily Islamic studies, but there's an aspect to that. So, you study the history, you study the politics, and then if you want, you can also choose certain courses where you can focus on the religion. And I did do that. And I studied Sufism. I studied the philosophers from the golden age of Islam. So Avicenna, Averroes, and Al-Ghazali. And that was a beautiful time, honestly, to be a Muslim for me. I felt very spiritually high. It was a great environment where I felt open to question. And I joined the Muslim Student Association, ended up being on the board for a while. And all of the Muslim friends that I made there were ones who had grown up in the United States. Either they were born here or they came here when they were young. And their Islam was pretty, not watered down because they were sincere and faithful believers, but they just took the good parts. And I love that. And this is awesome. This is such a different environment than the one that I had grown up in. So, reading about Averroes, for instance, saying that if faith and reason contradict, then you should always go with reason because it means you misunderstood the faith, really blew me away because I'd never heard anything like that before. But now I know that Averroes is actually pretty heterodox for that very reason. For the reason that I liked him, he's actually not considered orthodox. But, I know these people are actually really smart. And now thinking about all these philosophers, I actually think that they were smarter than like the faith that they ended up working with, and they did a lot for it, a lot more than the primary sources themselves have. And they were used by like Western philosophers as well. Like we know that Aquinas like used Avicenna, and they preserved a lot of like Aristotelian philosophy. So there's something to that. And then I had this narrative in my head. Okay, cool. So Islam must have been awesome at one point. It's just that it was corrupted. And then the narrative became, oh, it's the Western powers, right, that corrupted it. And so Islam naturally is a good free religion that allows people to question. Um,
I ask a question, but I don't want to interrupt you. You just
no,
continue,
go
don't
for
answer it. So
it.
you lived in the birthplace of Islam, but somehow the Western people corrupted Islam in the birthplace of Islam, being racist and so many other things.
Well, yeah, I don't know if I
What?
thought of it that much,
Yeah,
but
I know
yes.
you didn't, but continue, please.
Exactly. I mean, there's so many issues, and I was very naive with a lot of my thinking, of course. But that was a narrative I was being fed in my university, not just about Islam, right? Like there was this like liberal push to like be fed this narrative in general. So it was very convenient because it also fit the Islamic side of things. So I said, okay, cool. So I am hoping to get back and practice this like pure Islam at the same time that that all of this was happening. To be honest, like I was having certain issues like about how pluralistic Islam kind of was, because it was sort of making an exclusive truth claim, but it also wasn't. And what I mean by that is, Islam, the Quran is kind of confused, which is why I was confused, right, about who really is saved. Sometimes you'll read verses that tell you that Muslims and Jews have nothing to fear, and other times you'll read verses that say they have everything to fear, right? Like they're totally wrong about their concept of God, that you should fight them. And so I was kind of confused. And now I understand I was right to be confused because it was confusing. So I couldn't really, that didn't sit well with me, that idea that especially people of the book wouldn't be saved. And so I was really drawn to Sufism because it was this, very wishy-washy understanding of Islam. And, we're all one, and it's like an ocean of God, and we're all parts of this ocean. And that sort of made sense to me. So I was drawing closer to that, and I started gravitating towards modern interpretations of Islam that are very feminist, and it essentially reinterpreted everything. It's like the only reason that men have four wives is for this specific case, and then yes, technically Muslim women can't marry people of the book, and Muslim men can, but that was also for that specific reason. But now they can, and so they're making modern fatwas, right, on these things, and I was actually taking them and trying to apply them to my life. But I feel like that's a problem, right? It's like once you go down that path of trying to reform this religion, it's like you're kind of on your way out a little bit. So after college, I go back home for a little bit, and there the environment is not great again. And I'm starting to realize that how high I feel spiritually is very much directly related to my environment and the people that I'm around, and that my belief system is really not that strong. And so eventually I leave home, and then I realize all of a sudden that I don't know if I believe. I started questioning everything. And it got to the point where I didn't necessarily just question Islam. In fact, I just kind of like leapt over that and I just went straight to God and I questioned whether I even knew that God existed. And my logic there was, well, if God were to exist, then he would be something infinite, right? It's like an infinite being. And that's kind of unfathomable. Like a human mind can't really make sense of that. You can't hold that idea in your mind. But if he didn't exist, then there's something else other than God that's also infinite, right? I mean, one could just say that that's just God. But in my mind, I assume maybe the universe is infinite, right? I mean, that's kind of nonsensical, but nothing really made sense. So ultimately, I just concluded, okay, nothing makes sense. It's actually impossible for anyone to truly know whether God exists or not. And so I became an agnostic in the sense that I just thought that, both options made no sense. Um, Funnily enough, despite the fact that I was, leaving the religion, I was actually working at an organization where I was defending religious freedom. And we were specifically working on religious freedom issues within Islam. And so we were trying to make arguments for religious freedom from within the Muslim faith. So we figured there's so many issues, right, with minorities being persecuted in Muslim majority environments, that we wanted to help help them out by, instead of making secular arguments, which is what we often saw people doing, using the Quran itself, right, using the Hadith wherever possible. And it was great, but even as I was doing this work, I started to realize this is really difficult to do from within the Muslim sources themselves. I mean, especially for instance, like an issue like apostasy. Yes, the Quran says no compulsion in religion. You can use that. Of course, one could just respond and say that's abrogated. And then, there's the hadith. It's very clear cut. It's very authentic. You can't really argue around it that says whoever changes his religion, kill him. So it's very difficult to do. The best we could do maybe was argue against blasphemy, because, blasphemy laws are also a serious issue in a lot of Muslim majority environments. Um, and I was working with a lot of people who were Christian themselves. And this was kind of like my first encounter with Christians where I finally heard a convincing case for Christianity. And it wasn't it wasn't convincing enough at the time for me to say, "Oh yeah, I believe." But it was the first moment where I thought, "Huh, I can actually see why someone might believe this." And one of the questions that I got a really good answer to was, "Can you explain the Trinity to me?" And it was this guy who knew his faith really well, very devout person. And I can't even remember what he said at this point, to be honest, but I think it was something along the lines of making an analogy to what we had in Islam, right? And he said, well, you have God's eternal word, and how is that separate from God? And which I never thought about. And I said, that's really interesting. They're kind of just being as intellectually honest as they possibly can be using the sources and the revelation that they've received. So that's interesting. But anyway, I didn't believe. I continued in my agnosticism. And things happened in the culture slowly that I was questioning. I saw the culture around me shifting in ways that were morally objectionable to me, and also shifting in ways where I thought that reality and objective reality itself was being questioned. And I didn't understand how we'd gotten to this place. And so I started to question whether people who believed in God might actually have some wisdom, like maybe there's something to that because they're not falling for this and they're
Yeah.
not buying this.
Before we change the, we'll go to the next segment of your story. I
Sure.
just want to say, probably you had the hardest job in all of the world, that you promoted religious freedom in an Islamic context. It is almost, it's not almost, it has 100% impossible, because it is, Islam is so clear and so strict about that: love Muslim, hate the non-Muslims. It
Hmm.
is so clear you can't, no matter what environment you're in the West, in Mecca, in Medina, it doesn't matter. It stays the same. There's a love for Muslims, and there's a hatred toward the non-Muslims, and then there's all sorts of verses that um, the clear path of Islam is this: you're a Muslim if you're people of the book, you pay jizya to
Hmm.
stay alive, and then if you're pagan, you don't even have those options. So you convert or you pay tribute, and you
Yes.
feel humiliated. That's the option. So you convert to Islam, you stay Christian or Jew, and then pay tribute. Or if you're pagan, we don't have that option for you. And then within that context, you were fighting for freedom of what? And
No,
it is
absolutely.
amazing. That's when you talk about it, start thinking about it. What a job is that? But Western
Yeah.
mentality in the scholarly, in the intellectual, in the universities, in the leftist Islam, you think you have these hopes of reform within Islam,
Yes.
and
Yes.
then the reformers are usually the number one groups of minorities among Muslim communities that are persecuted, number one, or totally disregarded or expelled or
Hmm.
killed, cleansed.
Agreed.
So you work in that context. I'm like, what in the world? What kind of job? I don't want that job.
Yeah. You know what's funny? I didn't even think that at the time, but you're right. The only way to make that argument, which is what we ended up doing, is to cherry pick. You absolutely just had to cherry pick. You could not be faithful to the Muslim
You
faith.
can be consistent. You
No,
can't.
you can't. You absolutely cannot.
Yeah.
But the thing is, and here's a bit of an argument for that position, is that there's so much within the Muslim sources that's contradictory. It's like I kind of don't blame people for cherry picking because even the opposing viewpoint to a certain degree also kind of cherry picks. Of course, if you're to give a holistic, like representation of what the faith says, it's not, there's
I
no
think
religious freedom.
if you understand the two houses of Islam,
Yeah.
I think if you understand the abrogation doctrine within Islam, I think it is not contradictory.
Hmm.
Um, it,
Okay.
you might see it from the outside as a contradiction, but it's not. It's Islam when you're weak, Islam when you're strong, Islam when you don't have the upper hand, Islam when you have the upper hand. When you have the upper hand, there is no reform, there is no conversation about freedom. Well, when you don't have it, you work toward it to get it.
Hmm.
And then when you have the upper hand, then you don't need to talk about freedom of religion because Islam
Yeah.
has already overtook that place or the house or the society or the political situation. Then you don't need to hide anything. But when you don't have the
Yeah.
upper hand, when you're not in power, you have to hide things in order to be say, oh, we're tolerant and we have freedom of religion. Muhammad was a feminist, and all of that, because you're working your
Yes.
way toward that, knowingly or unknowingly.
Hmm.
The knowing is the scholars that they know, the multi-billion-dollar associations, organizations hired by the Saudis
Hmm.
to get you there. But you didn't know this. But you're kind of an employee of this
Yep.
situation, working toward their goal, and you're but it is I get it, it's the hardest job on the planet Earth, because if you're honest, you open this
Yeah.
text, you're like, "R- so a man can marry four women, a woman marries four men, stoning.
Yeah.
Where is equality in this thing?" Then
Yeah.
you
There's no
realize, oh
quality.
man, so Allah has must have the wisdom and we don't. That's the answer.
Yes.
Allahu alam, they say. But
Yes.
glory to God.
Exactly.
I don't want to
No,
divert too much,
exactly.
but I think you had I have some compassion for you. You had a very hard job.
Thanks.
Continue, please.
Yes. Yes. No. No. I totally agree with you. There's totally a lot there that we could totally spend some time on, but yeah, the whole Muhammad being
Maybe
a
in
feminist.
another episode that we do together, we'll talk specifically on that.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Cool. Yeah, there was it was an interesting job, I will say, and it was interesting to also see fellow Muslim, I guess I wasn't Muslim anymore, but Muslims within the faith of their own accord making arguments for religious freedom. But like you said, they definitely don't represent Orthodox Islam. So yeah, I ultimately ended up leaving that job, and changing careers completely. But my journey continued with, just watching what was going on around me in the culture and seeing changes that I was very unhappy with. And slowly I started to notice that my own positions were moving closer and closer to what I would now describe as, the positions of lowercase o Orthodox Christians. Um, and I started to think that maybe there's something to religion. And even though my positions were actually not necessarily in line with Orthodox Muslim positions, let's say on issues of like abortion, right? I was actually closer to the Christian position at this point. But I thought maybe there's something to religion and I should give it a chance. I was also, really struggling with feelings of meaninglessness and, thinking about what the point of life is, and nihilism, which I think is a natural conclusion if you're being honest to, agnosticism or atheism. And I was married. My marriage fell apart. At the same time, I was also trying to reconcile with my parents. I remember meeting with my dad after not having seen him for like 8 years. And one of the very first things he did is like berate me. And I was really hurt by that and thinking like, I haven't seen you in so long. And this is the first thing you say to me. And that conversation didn't really go well. So I was in therapy. I was really depressed. Nothing made sense anymore. And I got it in my head that I think I should look into believing in God. I think I need something. I need hope. I am absolutely hopeless. I kind of looked around me, like metaphorically, and just saw like utter destruction, I felt like, and I didn't know how I'd gotten there. Um, so I decided to turn to the Quran actually again because I hadn't yet rejected Islam the first time that I left it for Islam itself. And at the same time, I had met this friend who's Christian, and she suggested that I read the Bible. And I had been open to it because I was kind of curious, just having had Christian friends in the past that I deeply admired. I thought that maybe there's something to it. And at this point, I wasn't gung ho about Islam and thinking that it was absolutely true. I never actually felt that. So maybe there's something to it, especially when Islam explicitly tells me that there's something to the people of the book's faith. So it gave it legitimacy in my mind. Um, I remember asking this friend, "Can you explain the Trinity to me?" And this is always a thing for me that I feel like if I can't get an answer to this, I can't ever accept Christianity, right? This is at the heart of it. This is one of the core teachings, and it doesn't make sense. And she told me that it was a mystery. She might have given some answer that didn't really convince me at the time, but it was enough for me to want to read the New Testament, which she had suggested that I do, because I would have started from Genesis, and that might not have been the best idea. So I got a Bible and I got a Quran and I started reading them together at the same time. And around that time, I also started consuming content online of people who either left Islam for Christianity and vice versa. I was also comparing the two to see if their arguments were convincing to me, and a ton of debate. This is when I discovered like Nabil Qureshi, and I was blown away by his story. Even though I hadn't been Muslim at that point, I still didn't understand how someone could choose Christianity over Islam, because in my mind, Islam's concept of God, at least that's the only thing that I was going off of, made more sense. And so I was very intrigued by his story. And I also loved him as a person. Like, he was just such a lovable person, even though I disagreed with him. So that also won me over. And I watched so many videos from him. And I remember, and I didn't know at the time that unfortunately he had passed away. When I found that out, it devastated me. And seeing, his last few videos that he put out, and seeing the comments where people would say to him, this is a curse that God put upon you for leaving Islam and for not, accepting Christianity. I even thought, hey, maybe they're right. Like, why isn't he reverting now? Like this, there's some clear evidence. And he insisted, no. He said, the more I think about it, there's no way that Muhammad is a real prophet of God. And I just know that, Christ is true. And that made me really want to understand why he said that. Like, I said, I absolutely have to understand what's going on here. So one of the first issues that I encountered was because I was comparing specifically the story of Jesus Christ himself, because obviously, he's very prominent in both books. And it was related to Maryam, or Mary, Jesus' mother. And in the Quran, she's referred to as being the sister of Aaron and the daughter of Imran. And so I didn't know this, obviously, and I had no reason to question this beforehand, right? Not knowing anything about the biblical narratives. But then I found out, oh no, in the Bible, that's the wrong Mary, or technically Miriam, right? So to me, immediately, this was clear evidence of plagiarism done very poorly. And there was even a hadith about it where Christians did question Muhammad about this, and they said, "Wait a minute, you got the wrong, woman, and you mixed her up with Miriam, sister of Aaron and Moses, and they're hundreds of, if not 1,000 years apart." And he gave such an unconvincing response to that. And almost immediately, I said, "Okay, this was it for me. This was a huge red flag," which might surprise people because oftentimes they'll think it's like moral objections or moral issues, which I'll get to that. But I have to say, things that are like provably false, like logically, were more convincing to me because at the end of the day, moral issues are a bit harder to prove or disprove because you can just say, well, it's God, right? Who am I to say like this is or isn't wrong, right? But then after that, I got to the moral issues, some of which I had never encountered before. So that was the first thing, Mary Miriam mix up, and then I started to question the crucifixion. Right? Why did God make it appear as if he were crucified? Which I never asked. Like, it's not a thought that crosses your mind as a Muslim. But what's the purpose of it? And also, what does this mean about the nature of God himself if he's willing to deceive people, to deceive them to the point of them starting this religion that is now the world's largest religion as a result of this one act of deception? There's truly no purpose to it. So that made no sense. And then what's the purpose of the virgin birth? There's really no purpose other than just divine showmanship and God just showing that he can. And then I found this to be the case across the board with so many things that, and I had no idea that they had a purpose, that they had meaning in Christianity. So many things had a purpose and had meaning and had like these really beautiful, rich narratives and like stories behind them. And Islam had no purpose. And then I started to see that the Quran was just completely fabricated and it was just like a mishmash of various sources, not just the Bible, and also getting things wrong, right? That's the problem. It wasn't just copying them, but also apocryphal, like, gospels and random pagan origins and Zoroastrian things, and just all across the board, right? Like things that I had no idea. Again, I don't know how I didn't know this. I'm kind of I feel betrayed by like my university for not teaching me these things. It's like this is something that is well known. I should have been taught these things, but no, I wasn't. So I knew as I was reading the New Testament, I finished reading the Gospels. By the time I finished reading the last Gospel and answering all the questions that arose as a result of that, I knew definitively that Islam was false. Like there was no question about it. At that point, I'd also gone down the rabbit hole of reading all the morally objectionable things that Muhammad had done and understanding some Quranic passages that, sad to say, that some of them I had read, and Arabic is my first language. So while I know Arabic, Quranic Arabic is not the same, right? I mean, it's different enough that there are some words that you just can't understand unless you really like do in a study of it. Some that I was repeating, and I realized I was repeating the most vile things ever. Some of them are, I don't know, very like sexual and explicit, and I had no idea. And then there are certain passages that are so objectionable that I physically felt sick for like a week afterwards. I remember thinking back to all the times that I was defending this faith, all the times that I thought that, I had the moral high ground and I was defending something that's so disgusting and despicable. So it really messed with me, to be honest. Even though I hadn't believed in a while, I had spent all those years not believing, still thinking that there was something good to this religion, and trying to better it in whatever way that I could. So I got to a point where I knew Islam was false. I didn't yet get to a point where I knew that Christianity was true. But my experience reading the Gospels, from reading, the Gospel according to Matthew, getting to the Sermon on the Mount, and the Beatitudes, blew me away. I mean, almost every issue that I felt like I had with Islam, I felt like was addressed there, and it was so specific. It's like so many of the things that like people complain about, people praying and making sure that you're doing things for show and ensuring that people are following the rules in this particular way are very clearly addressed and condemned there. And then comparing women's rights in Islam and men having four wives, and all the hadith about women being the majority of inhabitants of hell and being hung by your hair just for showing your hair, and comparing that to like Jesus speaking about divorce and how you should treat your wife, and if you were to leave her, it's as if you've committed adultery on her. So blew me away. The concept of forgiveness again was something that was a thread that just went throughout the Gospels, and I was shocked to discover just how radical the teachings of Christ were, because I had only been familiar with the Quran, and I assumed that all religious traditions had really problematic, morally questionable teachings in them. I assumed that was true of the Gospels or of the New Testament as well, and that was so far from the truth. I was reading this and thinking this would be radical had it been written today. And this was written 2,000 years ago. This was hundreds of years before the Quran. And it's so much better, like so much kinder, so much truer. And as I was reading, I was bawling like a child the entire time. I just felt like it was already working on me, even though I didn't believe. But a part of me, I started feeling like I wanted to believe this. It was like, if this were true, this would be one of the greatest things ever. This would be amazing. Like, I wish this were true, but I just, don't believe it yet. Um, I absolutely fell in love with the person of Jesus Christ as described in the Gospels. I kept reading the rest of the New Testament. Eventually, I started to see that so much of what I valued and loved about, like Western society, about, our environment is stuff that came down to us from Christianity, right? And I started to see the influence of Christianity in all these beautiful ways. At the same time that I was reading the Gospels, because I had also struggled with the idea of God's existence in general, I was also reading up on arguments for God's existence. And I realized I was very arrogant to have just assumed that I could think it myself and assume that, nobody had a good response for it. So I started then to see kind of God everywhere. I mean that in that there were arguments for him everywhere, and not just spiritually, but philosophically, this made sense. Logically, this made sense. And if God were true, then perhaps one of these world religions is the right one. And then I started going down the rabbit hole of trying to understand the Bible's historicity, right? And I also realized how unpreserved the Quran is, and that I had been lied to all my life about how well preserved it is, and how there were serious issues about the history of how the Quran was preserved, and that the Bible was so well attested, that we have so many manuscripts, and that we can, for all intents and purposes, trust what's written in it, and that what we have today is effectively what was written. But also, in Christianity, we don't make this claim of like word for word, letter for letter preservation. And the Bible, unlike the Quran, isn't God's direct eternal word. That's Jesus Christ himself. And then things kind of just started to fall into place and make sense logically. Um, and it got to a point where I started to think, I think the best explanation for life is Christianity, just from an intellectual perspective. Um, and I, spent some time trying to understand the Trinity, which is a huge one for me. So I read quite a bit on that. And then it got to the point where not only did I feel like I understood the Trinity, but the best explanation for God was the Trinity. So it actually made more sense than the monadic view of monotheism that Islam had. So I got to a point where I was like, okay, I think I need to go to a church. This is starting to make sense. And then I started visiting churches, and I visited all sorts of churches. Every time I entered a church, I would just start bawling, and I just couldn't control it. And I definitely felt like this is where God was calling me. I did have at one point a really strange experience, and I don't know what to make of it, but I'll mention it here and we can talk about it. But there was one night, this was where I was on the verge of essentially saying that I believe, and I went to sleep, and I had this, my Christian friend that I was texting all these questions that I had and updating her on my journey. And I have on my phone both an Arabic keyboard and an English keyboard that I switch between. But I rarely use the Arabic keyboard unless I'm like talking to someone who speaks Arabic, which is rare these days. But I went to sleep, woke up, and my phone had switched to the Arabic keyboard somehow. it was on. I don't know how. And it was like, it opened Chrome and it searched something in Arabic. I know this is sounding crazy. And it said Durar Islamiyya, which means Islamic pearls. And it has like the result of like, oh, the beauty of Islam. And it creeped me out. It creeped me out. And I was like, wait a minute. Am I making a mistake? Is this what the someone is telling me this? Yes, it's possible I was just hacked. I don't know. But and then I was like, wait a minute, I don't think so. I know for a fact now. Now I understand intellectually. Like I deeply believe that Islam is false. There's nothing that convinced me otherwise. And then I think the very next night I went to sleep, and I've never had sleep paralysis before or after, but I experienced sleep paralysis, and I felt, so I was awake essentially, but my body was completely paralyzed. But I literally felt myself leaving my body and having an out of body experience and just ascending. And I got to a point where I thought, oh, I think maybe I'm going to heaven. Maybe I'm going to get an answer to all these questions. But then I ended up in this really strange, dark place. And I was seeing all these weird creatures, and it made no sense. And there was like this weird cat. And I started getting freaked out. And I had been watching so many testimonies of people accepting Christ that I remember one guy was saying when he encountered a demon, which is what I was wondering if that was happening to me at that point, he just said, I rebuke you in the name of Christ. And I said that, and all of a sudden, I went right back down into my body and I woke up. And that never happened again. And that's when I realized, okay, I, I believe in this. And I ended up going to a church. I found a church, that, I thought was, biblical and following the Bible as it should be. And I told them I wanted to get baptized. They told me I had to take a class, which I was unhappy about, but so they made me wait a little bit. But ultimately, I ended up getting baptized. And yeah, that's my story.
That's awesome. I think I can sit here, I don't know, hours, and just listen to you. You're very likable. You talk
Thank you.
clearly. What a phenomenal story you have. Thank
Thank you.
God for Jesus and um, being in the birthplace of Islam among the Orthodox Sunni Muslim. You can't say there's a better or a clearer or more pure Islam than
Yeah.
what's in the Saudi or in Mecca or in Medina. And then
Yeah.
in the depth of that, in the heart of Islam, you were treated the way you were treated, discriminated against, and
Yeah.
you were supposedly an abd or whatever.
Yeah.
And then coming to the West, and then trying to defend Islam, criticizing Christianity and Trinity,
Yes.
and now you believe in a triune God. It is an awesome story you have, sister. What an
Praise be
awesome
to
story
God.
you have. I just want to point out one thing you said about the Beatitudes. Sometimes we use these terminologies in Christianity, and the world that is watching might not be familiar. You're talking about Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, and specifically chapter 6 and 7 of the book of the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus is speaking to the people and sharing some things. When I was reading it, sister, I just want you to know that I really doubted the gospel because imagine I became a Christian, and then I started reading had an encounter with God,
Hmm.
heard the gospel, accepted the Christianity, the Lord Jesus Christ, and then somebody gave me a New Testament, and I started reading it. In Matthew chapter 6, Matthew chapter 7, I said, there is no way, there is no way in the whole world that could Jesus describe Islam before Islam was incepted.
Wow.
I
Yeah.
said, this cannot, Christianity has, or this book
Hmm.
has to come after Islam, or it must be divine.
Yeah.
These were my two. I mean, I battled the same way you're talking about bawling, reading this thing. I
Hmm.
would fight. I would throw my God. God knows, I would throw my New Testament across the room and get
Wow.
so mad at it and go pick it up and read it again. Like
Wow.
I had such a. I think Jacob experienced this and called it.
Hmm.
He wrestled and
Yes.
limped after he wrestled with God that
Yes.
night. That was my story. I was reading this thing. I wrote about it in my book, actually, Forsaking My Father's Religion. I'm going to read just a little bit of it in about Matthew chapter 6, verse 7. Jesus said, "And when you pray, do not use vain repetitions as the heathen do, for they think they will be heard for the many words."
Mm.
That single verse captured the very way my mother and I had prayed our whole life.
Yep.
I spent years repeating the same memorized phrase in Arabic, in a language I didn't understand, 5 times a day, hundreds of the times of the day through the beats, calling Subhanallah, 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 thousands of times. And Jesus calls it, that's a practice of pagans.
Yeah.
And I would throw my I mean, I would get so mad at him. Like, how did you know we're doing this? Like,
Yeah.
this is just one verse, verse after verse after verse in that in those 2 chapters.
Yeah.
The best apologist of all time debunks the public prayer of hypocrisy of standing in the
Yes.
street corners,
Yep.
correcting others, stopping traffics,
Yes.
vain repetitions, and somehow these things you think you're gonna bring you righteousness, and
Yeah.
he debunks it as hypocritical and
Absolutely.
pagan practices. I mean, I would get mad and cry and yell and then love it and then just go through it. But the word of God was washing over me, washing the filth of Islam out of me,
Yeah.
purifying my soul, my mind that was brainwashed that these things would add point to the right side of the scale. The
Yes.
Nakir Munkar is going to write the good deeds. Thank you, Jesus, that
Yes.
you rescued me from it.
Yes. Absolutely.
And then you went through it, you were reading the gospel, the New Testament, and then you come
Yeah.
to these 2 chapters, you're like, this is miraculous. It's awesome. I'm hearing that. So I'm not the only crazy one then, Gloria.
Yeah, I feel like this is a common thread that I've heard from a lot of ex-Muslim Christians, that the Gospel of Matthew, the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount specifically, really affects us. I think it really does touch on so many of the issues within Islam. Like, it's just, if you weren't sure that Islam is false, I feel like that definitely seals the deal. It's described so
That's it.
perfectly, so
Perfectly.
perfectly.
The fasting. They tell you in the mosque you have to have the sad countenance on, and
Yes.
Jesus says, "Do not do.
Yeah.
You're not fasting
Absolutely.
for people. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
it is not a public
Yeah.
demonstration of your
Exactly.
really religiosity." Oh,
Yes.
sometimes the
Yes.
word, but think about it. It is not for other. It's if it's a religion, if it's faith, it's between you and God.
Yes.
And the
Exactly.
only two people need to know is you and God. God,
Yes.
I'm doing this for you, or even though that's even a wrong terminology, because He doesn't need our acts. He needs our faith. He needs our heart. He wants our heart. He wants to love
Yes.
us and be in a relationship. But in an Islamic terminology, if even that is a faith issue or a religion issue, it should be between you and Allah. But it's
Yes.
absolutely none of that. It is always between you and the Ummah. I'm proving it
Exactly.
to them how pious and how wonderful of a Muslim I am. And then if they don't see it, I'm going to brag about it and talk about it, invite them over to dinners and talk about it.
No, absolutely. Oh my gosh. The number of times I remember being hounded on whether you prayed, it's like, or whether you fasted. It's like, come on. Like, this is not real sincere faith here. Like, this is just a show, right? A show for everybody. So it's very unfortunate, but it's the case in Islam.
Tell us, of course, I've found you on YouTube, send the invitation on YouTube. Tell us, what do you do on YouTube or social media, how
Yes.
people can get a hold of you and support your work. I think that's
Sure.
very, very important.
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, I'm a relatively new YouTuber. So I started this channel pretty much to talk about these experiences. I kind of wanted an outlet, but I also felt that there's so much that I wanted to say to Muslims. And these are things that I'm putting out that I wish I had known, right? These are things that I felt I was betrayed by. So I'm
Mhm.
putting out information about Islam, but also my goal is to draw people to Christ. So it's, two sort of purposes, and also support for other ex-Muslims, right? To encourage them to come out and speak out and share their stories as well.
So this you told us a lot without telling us anything. So it's catechized. How do you say it?
I regret choosing this name, but it's a portmanteau of chat and catechized, so it's
Oh,
catechized. But
I
but
butchered it again, huh?
but you can
Okay,
say
I mean
catechized. Either works. So it's whatever. Yeah. Thank you.
catechized.
Yes.
Folks, we don't know what it is, but it's good stuff. Please go there and support the work that sister is doing. Subscribe to her channel. And I saw that you shared your story there. You
Yes.
said that reading the Quran, these were some of it. Of course, these are some shocks because
Yes.
sometimes you're a Muslim for 20 years, you never hear about it, anything, and then you go on a journey to uh, open this book on your own, and you're like, with a critical eye or with a
Yes.
reasonable mind, you try to research, and you're like, why nobody ever, for
Yes.
example, said that Muhammad, there is a chapter in all of the Quran that Muhammad curses his uncle and his wife. The
Yep.
whole chapter is about cursing
Yep.
his
Yep.
uncle and
Exactly.
his wife. That how evil they are, and their hands should be cut off, and
Yeah.
their abode is going to be in hell. For imagine this wonderful divine book of Allah comes down to his prophet to curse his uncle.
Yep.
Why?
Exactly.
Why we didn't know any of this? But then you open your eyes with a reasonable mind, you start reading, then you say, there is nothing divine about this, there is nothing truthful about it. Anybody could write this.
Yes.
You don't need to be prophet, you didn't need to be even anything. You
Yeah.
can write. You don't like your uncle, you just
Exactly.
say some gossip about him or her or whatever, and you put it in your book and you're done.
Yeah. I would say the average Muslim is even better. It could write better things than that, to be honest, because
For
they often
sure.
don't know what's in it. But no,
For
absolutely.
sure. So tell us what the focus of your YouTube channel is. Islam, just to
Yes.
show what Islam says to Muslims, and not leaving them there, because you can be agnostic and atheist and be miserable,
Yes.
because God exists. We're responsible to God. If you walk out of Islam, there is God. So you don't want to be there out in the atheism or agnosticism, hopeless, nihilist. We came from monkeys or whatever.
Ex-
So you don't want to leave people there. So you're helping them to get
yes.
out of Islam to the truth of Christianity. What else do you do?
Exactly.
What other platforms do you have, sister?
I mean, honestly, that's my main platform right now. I'm pretty new to just like the online platform world in general. So I have Instagram, but I honestly haven't posted much there yet. But I'm hoping to in the future. But no, yeah, exactly. You've described it perfectly. And so, for instance, I have a video on how to explain the Trinity to Muslims because I feel like that was a huge one for me, and I think it's a huge one for Muslims in general to try to understand.
Mhm.
So I don't have a ton of content there yet, but yeah, that's the goal of the platform.
Awesome. Make sure you put this content on your channel too.
Okay, will do. Thank you so much.
Praise the Lord, folks. You heard it. Another ex-Muslim, this time from Sudan, spent time in Saudi Arabia, came to the U.S., tried to fight for Islam and defend Islam and to do dawah for Islam, thinking, criticizing Christianity and debunking Christianity is a thing. But if you read the Bible, the Word of God does not discriminate. It is the truth, and the truth that you will know shall make you free. So, sister, I'm so thankful to accepting my invitation to be here. Is there anything else that you want to add, or we can close the hour?
No, just want to thank you so much for having me on. It's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Please come back, and if you have a specific subjects, topics you want to talk about, women in Islam or whatever else, I would love to hear it. And folks, make sure you're subscribed, share this. A lot of people out there need to hear this. And until next, God bless you, and you have a wonderful, wonderful day.